I'm Mark Hamrick with Bankrate.com. Welcome. This is where we try to connect the dots with your personal finances. And today, we're going to draw some lines between personal finances and the housing market. And our very special guest is Rick Sharga. He's Executive Vice President with RealtyTrac. And as we chat here, there's so much that's been going on in the housing market during a pandemic, during a 2-month recession, and now a big rebound with the U.S. economy. Rick, it's such a pleasure to have you join us here today.
I'm delighted to join you, Mark. Thanks for inviting me. And you're right, there's so much going on in the housing market right now.
For people who aren't, first of all, familiar with RealtyTrac, how do you describe it? And I'll remind some that they might have first heard about it during the financial crisis and Great Recession, the meltdown of the housing market, when you were omnipresent in the media telling us about what was happening, particularly with foreclosures back then. I can imagine things have changed a lot since then with both you and RealtyTrac.
RealtyTrac publishes the largest database of distressed properties in the country. And it's used primarily by real estate investors and real estate agents who are looking to find off-market and below-market properties. And those tend to be properties that are in some stage of foreclosure. We also have information on 110 million other residential properties, mortgage information, tax information. So for people looking for real estate investment opportunities, or for people looking for bargain properties they might want to try and buy to move into, those are the kind of things that people use RealtyTrac for.
Yeah, I'm sure you got the attention of some people there with the notion of quote unquote bargain. Let's talk about that a little bit. We've been seeing booming home prices, at least on a national basis, and obviously in many markets across the country. I'm sure you get asked by people, particularly those who are, let's say, older than 20 years old, whether we're setting up for another experience like what happened some 15 years ago or so. What's similar and what's different this time around?
The similarities, Mark, are largely superficial. It's very, very unlikely we're going to see a repeat of the sort of housing market cataclysm that led to the Great Recession back in 2008, when 6 million people lost homes to foreclosure. We are seeing rapid price increases in housing across the country, almost everywhere you look. Not unusual to see 16, 17, 18, even 20% year over year increases. Big differences between this time and last time, though, is the increases this time are driven by the laws of supply and demand. There are the largest group of millennials, which is the largest generation in the history of the country, who are rapidly approaching prime home buying age. So they're creating a lot of demand for housing. Also creating a lot of demand for housing is historically low mortgage rates, which actually make it more affordable in a lot of markets across the country to pay a monthly mortgage than to pay monthly rent. So those two things have really combined to drive a lot of demand. The lack of available supply, home builders have underbuilt compared to demand for the last 10 years, really since the Great Recession, have conspired to raise prices. But what's interesting is most of the people buying houses are move-up buyers. So about 70% of the people buying homes today are trading in one home to buy another home. What we saw during the Great Recession were first-time home buyers who were largely unqualified, who were getting bad loans to buy overpriced properties. The loans were largely adjustable rate loans, which meant the payments were due to go up. And the whole thing was just a house of cards that collapsed. So we're not seeing anything really in the market dynamics like we saw 10 years ago.
When people ask me about that, and obviously I don't have the level of knowledge about the housing market that you do because you are just so immersed in all that. The one thing that I like to try to remind people is it's seldom that the next financial crisis, leaving aside the pandemic, is, the exact template as the one from before, right?
Yeah, I think the industry, the mortgage industry in particular, really learned its lessons the last time. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau put some new lending rules in place that have prevented some of the excesses we saw during the run-up the last time. Loan quality has been extraordinary. Prior to the pandemic, we were running at about 50% less foreclosure activity and probably 25% less mortgage delinquencies than we've seen historically. So the challenge, of course, for the industry is that every time we learn lessons, It seems like we have novel ideas on how to create the next crisis. So we haven't found that novel idea just yet, although maybe this novel coronavirus was something that a lot of people were afraid might tip us into another housing market meltdown. Just the opposite has happened, which has surprised a lot of market analysts.
What do you tell people who might be a little freaked out either about the home prices they see in the state of California or elsewhere and wonder whether they should tip their own toes in the water of home ownership?
Well, according to the California Association of Realtors, the median price of a home in California is $800,000, which is just mind-boggling. It pretty much means neither of my kids will be able to afford to buy a house in California when the time comes. It's a very, very big challenge for first-time home buyers. If people can get into the market, the long-term prospectus on home ownership is that over time, typically your investment in a home will pay off. Typically, home prices go up over a long period of time. That doesn't mean there's not some risk. Their home prices do go up and down. So where people got into trouble during the last crisis, we had a ton of speculation, a ton of speculative buying in the market, people buying at the top of the market, anticipating prices would go up with the notion they'd sell the house off. And when prices went down instead of up, when the mortgage meltdown hit, it really left a lot of people in severe difficulty. In fact, I was talking to somebody recently and reminded them that during the Great Recession, about a third of homeowners were underwater on their mortgage, which meant they owed more on the mortgage than their home was worth. You juxtapose that with where we are today. We have a record amount of homeowner equity, $23 trillion in homeowner equity. That's one of the things that will prevent a wave of foreclosures, even if homeowners get themselves into financial distress, which does happen and is probably happening a little bit more right now because of COVID. They have the opportunity to be able to sell the home, probably at a significant profit, walk away with cash in their pocket and get a fresh start. At least a third of the homeowners who were in trouble during the Great Recession didn't have that option. So very, very different market dynamics than what we saw a long time ago. The truth of the matter is for most people, if they are financially ready for home ownership, historically, home ownership has proven to be a good thing for most families. It's a good way to sort of force savings. It's a good way to provide intergenerational wealth. And again, for most people, it's a good long-term investment. But the short-term issues, you do have market fluctuations. Prices can go up and down, and you have to be ready for that kind of volatility.
Absolutely. And you talked about the fact that you and I are both parents, or you referred to that fact, and I think about that issue as well. Is this going to be a structural problem in our country where generations of young people are not going to be able to get access to home ownership in the markets where they're working and residing?
Yeah, I think it's probably already made that structural shift, Mark, in some areas. If you look at the Bay Area in California, if you look at the Pacific Northwest, particularly Seattle, if you look at markets like Austin in Texas, home prices have escalated so rapidly that unless you're walking into a very high-paying job in the first place, affordability is going to be an issue. And that's true even with these historically low mortgage rates, which have kept affordability relatively available for people over the last couple of years. But one of the things that I think offsets that a little bit, and this is due to the pandemic, is it's very likely that somewhere between a quarter and a third of employees in the future are going to be able to work from home, which means you might be able to pick a lower priced market, buy a home there, and be able to do your job from where you might be living. We've already seen a pretty significant move from really the highest priced metropolitan areas, New York City, San Francisco in particular, LA to a lesser extent, where people have moved out of the cities into the suburbs, the far suburbs, even rural areas, and are working in those areas where they can afford to be homeowners, or it's at least more affordable for them to be homeowners, and they continue to be able to do their jobs.
And is that going to help places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, where perhaps home prices really haven't been ablaze for many years?
I don't know why we're picking on Tulsa, but yes, I mean there are markets where people would be surprised at how strong housing actually is. Tulsa is a great example. Columbus, Ohio, of all places, If you were to throw a dart at the map, that's probably not the place you'd be aiming, but it's been a very, very strong housing market for a number of years. Nashville, Tennessee, a very, very strong market for a number of years. So those kind of, we'll call them second tier only from a size perspective, not from a quality of life perspective. Those kind of second tier markets are probably going to benefit to a great extent. And what's really interesting about this cycle is the suburban and far suburban areas around those metro areas will benefit even more. We aren't talking too much about commercial real estate today, I'd imagine, but one of the things that I've been tracking is the rebound of commercial buildings, commercial properties. And it's been really fascinating to watch how much more rapidly suburban business districts have recovered compared to central business districts in the major metro areas. So we are seeing a lot of this movement to the suburbs. And one of the things that happens there is the suburbs no longer are bedroom communities where people are commuting from the suburbs into the cities. The suburbs are now becoming where the jobs are located or where there's a growing number of jobs. You mentioned I'm living in Orange County, California. Just off to the east is an area called the Inland Empire with places like Riverside and San Bernardino. During the last buildup to the housing crisis, we saw an awful lot of people go out there and buy homes because they could afford them and then commute an hour and a half, 2 hours into LA or Orange County or San Diego. This time we're seeing warehouse and distribution centers build up. We're seeing cloud computing centers build up. We're seeing people move there for jobs and then services move there and establish new jobs to support the new people that are living there. So that's a fundamental shift, again, very different than what we saw 10, 15 years ago.
And when you talk about the implications for urban areas versus suburban or even outlying areas, I know here in the Washington, D.C. area where I work and typically would be in my office downtown, I really haven't been in my office downtown. I'm wondering whether there's going to be an impact there on, let's say, the locations where homeowners are going to flock to. You know, you can remember a couple of years ago where there was this idea, some of it was a bit of a myth, some of it was based on fact that, you know, young people would only want to live in inner cities. They might get rid of the idea of car ownership. They wanted to be where the entertainment options were. Has that been turned upside down a little bit here, leaving aside the fact that many people eventually want to raise families too?
So I was probably a lone voice crying in the wilderness back when people were saying millennials would never be homeowners. All the research from everybody suggested just the opposite. They were just going to do it a little bit later. And in fact, that's what's happened. The average age of a first-time home buyer has gone from late 20s to mid 30s in the last decade as the millennials have come of age. And the pandemic didn't flip that premise on its head, but it accelerated a trend we were already seeing.
If we want to find out more, check out RealtyTrac, and you'll see Rick Sharga on a TV screen or hearing him on a radio speaker near you. Rick, thanks so much for being here today.
My pleasure, Mark. Love to do it again, and I really appreciate your inviting me.
And thanks to all of you for watching On the Money. We'll look forward to connecting with you again to connect the dots to your personal finances next time. I'm Mark Hamrick.